Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm the Reverend Jennifer Butler, and I want to welcome you to this roundtable on the sacred season of love, freedom, and justice. We're gathering to celebrate that this April, for the first time in 30 years, Muslims, Jews, Christians, Sikhs, Baha'is, Hindus, Buddhists, and indigenous nations will celebrate their holy days in the same month. And we see that convergence as very symbolic, maybe even divinely ordained, as our people right now need to reaffirm our shared values of love, freedom, and justice in order to disrupt white Christian nationalist attempts to decide what ideas, what identities, and practices are valued and protected in our nation. This sacred season presents the opportunity for solidarity, for prophetic witness, as we lament the rise of intolerance and discriminatory laws that threaten our nation's quest to be a multiracial and multi-religious democracy. We're here because we see what we're up against. We see that people are working to build barriers that target Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian voters and religious minorities. We see this in the Don't Say Gay bills in states like Florida and Ohio. We see it in bans on critical race theory that are efforts to obfuscate the truth about racism in our nation's history. We see it in bans on books about the Holocaust in Tennessee. We see it in the criminalization of the existence of transgender children in Texas. And we see it in legislation forbidding kids from joining LGBTQ clubs in Arizona. And that is just a sampling. So I'd like us to have a discussion about how that movement and those kinds of bills are an affront to our efforts to build a strong multi-faith and multiracial democracy, and how it's a threat to all of us, wherever we stand in terms of privilege. So my first question today and first invitation is for each of you, our esteemed panelists, to introduce yourselves and share briefly how your faith tradition inspires you to strive for a multi-faith and multiracial democracy. How is that central to your own religious beliefs? Can I start with Dr. Dent? I saw you nodding.
Yes, sure. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much to Faith in Public Life and Reverend Jennifer for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. I am Dr. Sabrina Dent, and I am the president for the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation. We're based in Richmond, Virginia, and we're a theological think tank and education organization where our faith calls us to take action and to advance justice and to seek reconciliation and sustainable paths for the entire beloved community. And so I'm delighted to be with the other panelists here today, which is representative of many of the members of the beloved community for us. And so as a person who identifies as spiritual, but has strong roots in the Pentecostal church as well as the Baptist church, I'm driven and inspired by the realities that from being a daughter of the Black church, that my inspiration comes from the liberation and freedom movement. It comes from those things that are representative of the example of Jesus in the Christian tradition, who was a liberator and who was one that sought to humanize one's experience by seeking opportunities for them to be liberated and free. And so that inspires me to do the work that I do. And I recognize that this work requires all of us. I am inspired by the text that my father often wrote to me in letters that was from the third epistle of John, verse 2, which states, "Beloved, above all things, I pray that you prosper and be in good health, even as your soul prospers." And for me, that text states that I want every aspect of your being to live and to thrive and to be. And the latter part of that text in verse 4 even talks about the person walking into their truth. So if a person is able to walk into that truth, they're able to be the fullness of themselves and the wholeness of their entire being, as they were made in the divine image of God, for me. And so, like, our work in the center is rooted in that, but it comes from the examples that I see and I saw growing up in my own tradition that modeled that compassion, and that really started with my parents. So that's what drives me to think about this. And even when I think about even friends that are on this webinar right now, Hurunnessa Fariad and I work together through the Sister Act podcast, that when I do this work, when I'm thinking about multi-faith, multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy, I'm thinking about the needs and concerns of all of humanity. And I'll speak more to that. I know we have more questions, but that's how I entered this conversation. That inspires me, is the tradition of liberation and justice. That is something that was introduced to me at a very young age. So it goes beyond just one's religious identity, but also the way in which culturally I show up in the world.
I really love that. Thank you so much. You would like to go next? Would Rabbi Danya, would you like to go? You're nodding vigorously too. So.
I'm nodding because that was so beautiful and powerful. Thank you, Dr. Dent. Hi, I'm Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg. I'm a scholar in residence at National Council of Jewish Women, which is a grassroots organization that mobilizes the Jewish community to fight for women, children, and families, particularly focusing on voting rights, on creating a safe, creating a courts that is independent, fair, and just. And we're very, very excited that, God willing, today will be a very important day for the Supreme Court, and on abortion justice. So those are our main issue areas. And for me, I mean, listen, Passover is coming up very soon, so I will just start there. For me, I can look even to the beginning of the Passover story when we see 5 women in the beginning of Exodus who are in a time of deep oppression as Pharaoh has decided to go after the Israelite children, because in every society, you go after reproductive autonomy as the first way of trying to control a community or a population, and has commanded a genocide functionally. And you see 5 women who make the decision to show up in different ways in solidarity with the community. You see Shifra and Pua, the midwives, who are presumably not Jewish, but it's not clear. But they use their location, their position of privilege, their occupation and their role, and risk their own life, and take civil disobedience and refuse to kill the Israelite infants as they are commanded to do. You see Yocheved, who is Moses's mother, who is the most impacted, and she refuses to believe what the Egyptians have told her about who she is. And she resists their genocidal and dehumanizing decrees and hides her child. And like so many mothers throughout history and so many parents, takes the ultimate sacrifice and is willing to risk her own child in order to try to save her child, and sends him down the river in the hopes that he will be okay, like parents see their children from the Gestapo, like parents have sent their children across the bridge into America, hoping that they will get through Homeland Security and get into safety through Mexico, across to Mexico. We see Miriam risking her own family's safety by outing herself to Pharaoh's daughter, who has found this infant. And we see Pharaoh's daughter, the picture of ultimate privilege, who goes out of her way to identify this baby and to say, okay, I'm going to defy my own father and adopt this child. So we see all of these women taking action in a situation of oppression and injustice, and to say what's happening now is not right. And we all have to show up in this moment in the ways that we can, from the places where we are, more impacted or less impacted, more privileged or less privileged, whatever roles and places of power that we have, and to try to do what we can on a greater or lesser scale, right? On a more systemic or more direct impact kind of way. And that's our obligation. And so that's my Torah, right? That's the Torah that we have. And so that animates me and shows me, our collective call for justice and solidarity and community. And I remember that after liberation, after our mythic liberation from Egypt, we are given a Torah that teaches us to set up a just society full of systems of economic justice and care. And we are told, remember that you were strangers in Egypt, therefore you must love the stranger, right? Even when you have privilege and comfort and care, we should always make sure that we are taking care of one another, those who are like you, those who are not like you. And so that's our obligation, and that's our privilege. And that's our opportunity always to learn and grow when we have the chance to hear and love and be in caring connection with one another. And so that is my tradition, and that is the holiday that I'm going to be celebrating imminently.
Oh my gosh, this is just so awesome. That is my absolute favorite text of all of Scripture. It's like this multi-faith, multi-racial coalition of women comes together to kick off God's presence in the world as the great liberator, right? And as a white Christian, I have to say that's not the way I was taught in the Bible. So for me, it has been a process of reclaiming and learning from other faiths. Like when I wrote my book, Who Stole My Bible? Because that's my story, right? Somebody stole my Bible and gave me the wrong interpretation. I had to go to the Jewish text. It's a Jewish text that I inherited as a Christian, or we kind of stole it from the Jews, right? But I had to go to Jewish scholarship to like really understand it. And I just love the way you helped us understand that text in a deeper way to apply it to this very moment we're in. Who would like to go next on our panel? Can I call on Manjit Singh? Oh.
Thank you, Reverend Butler, and thank you for this opportunity to Faith in Public Life for inviting me to speak and for organizing this this panel and the important topic that we're all talking about. My name is Manjit Singh. I'm the co-founder and member of the board of the Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund. We are a national nonprofit that advocates on behalf of the civil and religious rights and social justice for all Americans. As a practicing Sikh, what motivates me personally is the inherent core belief in Sikhism that we all humanity is one and comes from one divine source. So if we believe in that worldview and in that core belief, then how can we discriminate against somebody who's our own? And at this time of the year, the Sikhs celebrate their annual New Year, which is on April 14th. And then at the same time, it is also the origination of the formation and the creation of the Sikh fraternity called Khalsa, where we commit to social justice, to liberty, religious liberty, and freedom for all. And that's what inspires me, and that's the reason I'm here, and that's the reason why we as an organization stand steadfast to oppose these various legislative laws and actions being taken in several states to somehow limit our other fellow human beings in this country to live a life somehow lesser than what we want to enjoy. So with that, thank you.
I love that so much. I'm learning so much in recent years about the Sikh faith and this whole idea that all of humanity is one. It's really, really beautiful. Hurunnessa Fariad, I saw you were about to jump in earlier, and so
Okay, no worries. Thank you so much, Reverend Jennifer, and everyone at Faith in Public Life, and my fellow panelists for being here today on topics that I think are issues that resonate throughout all of our faith groups and traditions. And it's so wonderful to be here, especially now at this month when so many different faith groups are celebrating their holidays and what that means for us individually, but also collectively. My name is Hurunnessa Fariad. I'm Director of Outreach at Multi-Faith Neighbors Network. It's an organization that was founded by a rabbi, an evangelical pastor, and an imam. So Pastor Bob Roberts, Rabbi David Saperstein, and Imam Majid put this organization together to tackle Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, and also understanding what it means to come from the evangelical Christian perspective and having them interact with Muslims and people of the Jewish faith across the United States and also overseas as well. But our main focus is here in the United States. You know that there's over $35 million in donations that go into Islamophobia rhetoric, and anti-Semitism is on the rise as well. So our job is to make sure that we're dealing with those issues from clergy and into the congregations, and letting people interact with one another and build relationships and get to know one another, not just through dialogue, but also understanding the needs and wants of the community. My main job, one of my main jobs, is to make sure that women are part of the conversation. And the minute you say clergy in all three faith traditions, there's usually a lack of women being involved. But my job is to make sure that women are involved from the three faith groups in this organization when we're doing our retreats all across the United States, and that we're able to change the narrative. And one of the things that I love about this organization is that everyone comes with who they are. No one's watering down their religion. We don't agree on everything theologically, but that's okay. And we respect each other. When I have to pray, they make sure they put time in the breaks for me to go pray. And when they need to do their prayers or their services, we're all accommodating for that as well, because our differences is what makes us special. And our differences is what needs to be respected. And I think a lot of times we tend to forget that. We just focus on the similarities, but we forget that there are differences. But how do you work around that in respecting and loving one another like you would your own family? In Islam, as you know, it's the month of Ramadan right now, and everyone is fasting or should be fasting. There are exceptions to people who can't fast as well. And this month is focused on becoming closer to God. And you're fasting all day, you're not eating, you're not drinking. And this is a commandment of one of the 5 pillars of Islam as Muslims, that what we believe. And like Manjeet said, for us, we also believe that all of humanity, all of the humans on this earth are created by one God, and that our final destination is back to him. And now who gets where and what, that's up to God. We're not ones to judge, but we do what's best, we feel is best for us in our way of connecting to God. And when we look at multi-faith and multiracial democracy in Islam, we can go back to the time of our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and look at his example, because he led Quran by example. In Medina, where Muslims, people of the Jewish faith, Christians lived as well, all of them were protected under the Islamic law. All of them were protected under the Prophet's reign, regardless of what their faith tradition was. It didn't matter. Justice was for everyone, and if a Muslim violated the rights of a Jewish person, then he would have to understand the consequences, and vice versa. So it wasn't based on what faith you are and how you practiced your religion or how you viewed God, but the fact that you were living under someone who practiced a certain specific religion of Islam, and he made sure that everyone underneath him was protected. And so using that as an example of something that happened over 400 years ago, we can live by those traditions even today. and that I myself would protect Sabrina or Danya or Manjit or Sunita or yourself, because as a human being, that's my job. My religion commands me to make sure that I am allocating justice to everyone around me. You know, there's a verse in Surah Nisa in the Quran, as a holy book, where God talks about making sure that we're just, and we're making sure that justice is around us, even if it's against ourselves. And I find that verse so profound, that for us as human beings, we're always looking at justice from the perspective of pointing fingers at other people and saying, you're not being just. But how about if we turn to ourselves and point the finger to ourselves? Are we being just? Are we giving everyone their rights? Are we being mindful of other people's needs before our own? And that really resonated with me a lot when I read that verse, because we don't do that. I don't think we do that often enough, even when we read that verse. But how wonderful would that be if we created a world where we're always looking at ourselves and making sure that our justice is coming from us justly to everyone else, that we're self-reflecting and looking at ourselves and making sure that we're not violating anybody else. And looking at that and connecting it to this world of living with people with other faith groups, it's doable. It has been done before, right? But we have to also be mindful that we can't push our own feelings, our own ideas on other people. We have to take them as they come, regardless of who they are. Because in the Muslim tradition, like I said before, we're all created by one God. And regardless of your skin color, your gender, or where you're from, or what language you speak, for us, we're all equal. And we have to make sure that we're advocating for that. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, that is so fantastic. And I love your exploration of difference, you know, that we come together to learn from each other. We're not looking to like believe the same things exactly. We honor and celebrate our differences and celebrate those, and then learn from each other. And the example of the prophet and what he said and did, I learned a lot. Sunita, I want to bring you into the conversation. There's your mute button. You got it.
Yes, thank you so much. It's just been wonderful listening to all of you, and really from deep within resonating with so much of what each of you have said. Yes, the differences make us special, but there's so much in common too that's just jumping out of this conversation. I'm Sunita Viswanath. I'm Executive Director of Hindus for Human Rights. And I want to say the other of my affiliations, because it'll give you a sense of my interconnected journey that speaks to all of the issues we're addressing today. I'm also co-founder and board member of Sadhana, Coalition of Progressive Hindus. I'm co-founder and former board member of Women for Afghan Women. And I'm a current advisory board member of a new advocacy organization called Unfreeze Afghanistan. I was born into an upper caste South Indian Hindu family, and I was that child that always complained and said, that's not fair, and spoke up when I thought something was wrong, even as a little child. And so, of course, I grew up to be a women's rights activist. And when I was small, I would speak up when untouchability was practiced in the home that I was growing up in. Even as a kid, I really felt that there was something very wrong with not touching the people that came into our house that were doing work. And this then informed work I'm doing now as an adult. But it was a long and circuitous journey to this work that I'm doing now, to build a Hindu platform, which is in every fiber grounded in the radically inclusive teachings that all of you are expressing, but also exist in the Hindu faith. And it's a teaching that exists in Hinduism, categorically opposed to every discrimination, everything that divides us, including caste, and this horrendous Hindu ideology, Hindutva ideology that has taken over, hijacked. I mean, my Gita has been stolen from me, Jennifer, just like you said. Hindu nationalism, which is Islamophobic and hateful, and really the cause of a lot of violence towards non-Hindus at this moment. But the same religion that I was born into exists teachings that lead some other Hindus to discriminate and to hate and be violent. And so while my faith also, just like Manjit Bhai tells me, and all of you tells me that we are all one. And if the God is in me and divine is in me and it is also in you, what about the you that is perpetrating violence, that is perpetrating hatred? That is the work. That is the most challenging aspect of the work. And influenced by the Afghans that I've worked with for over 20 years, who every time I would ask them, why in Afghanistan are you showing up for human rights work when you could be killed? The answer every single time is something along the lines of, it is my duty as a Muslim. And so over the many years of doing work on women's rights in Afghanistan, I have been challenged to ask myself, what does being a Hindu mean to me? What kind of Hindu am I? And what do I stand for? And like our rabbi, I think that the Hindu that I am is one that shows up. And so after being cooped up for 2 years of COVID, in this year, I've been able to show up. And I'm so glad to be able to again. In February, I was in a delegation, an Indian delegation. We called it a rainbow delegation that went to Selma. And so everything I experienced for the 57th bridge crossing in Selma is about voter rights and voter access. And so I feel very primed for this conversation. And the delegation that went was Hindu, Muslim, Christian, and Dalit. And we should have had the other identities as well of Sikh and Jain. And what's happening in India right now is that we are being divided from each other, and our delegation refuses to be divided from each other. And I just 2 days ago returned from Afghanistan. I was there for a week in Kabul with a women's delegation, actually the first American civil society delegation that went to Kabul after the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban. And our delegation included incredible faith leaders like Ruth Messenger and Reverend Chloe Breyer and Daisy Khan. And so we were an interfaith group, and also peace activists like Medea Benjamin. And we were a group of women that went together to say, we will not be divided from each other, and we will stand with the people of Afghanistan, the women of Afghanistan. And the challenging question is that the people who have won the war and taken over Afghanistan, they are the Taliban, they are the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. They are people that I have spent 20 years, their ideology is something that I spent 20 years fighting. I'm currently fighting Hindutva ideology, which is Hindu religious extremism. And so which part of my faith can I summon up to see the humanity in people who have ideologies that are opposed to mine? And what do I do? And how do I bring my faith into that public life that weaves together an interconnected, intersectional response to justice? And so I'm walking on this path, and I'm so honored to walk this path with all of you.
Oh my gosh, I felt such a deep personal connection to you and your sorrow over your faith tradition being stolen and hijacked and used for violence. And your presentation of your journey and what's happening reminds us that this is really a global struggle that we're about. You know, it's a global struggle against sort of authoritarianism and the hijacking of faith to endorse a particular worldview that dominates others. I want to ask you all along those lines, so to help us, sort of make meaning of this moment by giving a moral political analysis of what's happened and what's happening in America. I mentioned up front the number of bills passing in states that are denigrating and discriminating against select groups of people, or that are trying to hide our history from us. And it can look to some of us like these are just popping up and people are misbehaving everywhere. And Rabbi Danya, you mentioned the blocking of rights around choice and access to reproductive health and abortion. And so all of these things are actually intertwined, and there's a strategy afoot. And how do we make sense of that? How do you explain to people what's going on? What's the moral political analysis of that? Who wants to jump in? It's a big question, so I'm letting you gather your thoughts. That's why I'm being long-winded in my question, because I want you to think. Go ahead, Sunita.
Just in Selma in February, and we participated in the bridge crossing. And it was it was such a transformative experience. I haven't been before, and they have been commemorating the bridge crossing every year, and it was my first time to be a part of it. And on the morning of Bloody Sunday, we were in the Tabernacle Church in Selma, and Reverend William Barber gave the sermon. And I've heard him speak before, and I'm always incredibly moved because every time that he speaks about racial justice in this country, he reminds us that when Martin Luther King, in fact, in Selma, when finally they were able to cross the bridge and they got to Capitol Hill, Martin Luther King spoke about the Poor People's Campaign. So it's all connected. It's all connected. And the Poor People's Campaign, it was not about Black people. It was about all poor people. And Reverend William Barber always says something like this, that if you're going to address racial justice in this country, you have to keep in your heart the white poor, because they are the numerical majority of the poor. And so being in Selma and remembering that, and we also watched Eyes on the Prize as homework for going to Selma. And when you see images from the 3 marches, you will see not just Black people marching, but you will see mostly Black people, but many white people marched with them. And what Reverend Barber said when he started his sermon on this anniversary of Bloody Sunday, the first thing he said, and I don't think it was an accident, was that as he was driving to Selma this time, he stopped at the marker that marks the place where this woman, Violet Liuzzo, was killed by the KKK. And she was a white woman, a mother of 3, who came from Detroit, I believe, to participate and volunteer. And after the march was done, the 3rd march, she was driving volunteers back to where to go back home when the KKK killed her. And he said that he knelt at that marker and wept. And that is how he started his sermon that morning. And he can do that because he's Reverend William Barber. But I think in that is a moral calling, a spiritual calling to all of us. And it also is what I carried with me when I just traveled to Afghanistan. I met people who, the people in charge of that country right now are the Taliban. And India is hurtling towards being, if this ideology wins out, India will no longer be a secular democracy. It will be a Hindu Rashtra. And so what do we do with people from the majority community who maybe are fighting hateful ideology or maybe are somehow complicit in what's going on? And where do we find, the transformational, radical love, revolutionary love, Cornel West says? Where do we find that when we look at somebody who is not necessarily exactly on the path of what we maybe would consider a justice path? Where do we find that love? This is what I'm living with, grappling with.
Sunita, thank you. Dr. Dent, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sunita, for what you shared. And even in your last reflections, something that resonated with me in terms of your being honest about where you are on this journey, right? I think to connecting this back to the first question, even thinking about the season of Lenten for Christians that observe, right? This 40-day wilderness experience, this grappling with realities in life and looking at situations and how we ourselves respond to them. And so even in this season in my life, thinking about the principles of nonviolence, right? And figuring out, and really when you have to really sit and wrestle with the principles of nonviolence, not to just say them, not because it sounds good to say them, right? Like I believe these things, but when you think about the person that causes harm or moral injuries or physical injuries to a person, it's a whole nother reality when you have to address that and still do it from a place of compassion, right? And so for me, to answer your question, Reverend Jennifer, and thinking about the bills that are out here right now, because, there is historical that has shaped what is happening in the current context. So I'm going to raise this because I know it was mentioned specifically in the questions that were given to us about the Don't Say Gay bill, right? That what has happened in Florida, what has happened in Ohio, Even the bill that was introduced in the state of Virginia, HB 787, which basically told educators that if they taught divisive content in the classroom, and that if students felt any kind of way, felt threatened, or felt like they were being targeted because this history was being taught, is problematic and is punishable to individuals. One of the reasons why I wanted to bring up these bills is because on the surface, right? On the surface, for some people, it's about targeting LGBTQ individuals. But if you look deeper into what is in the bills, it goes into saying that this same history and this content cannot be taught in the classroom that impacts people. So my thing is, it's intentional, the efforts that are happening around this country right now, and that have historically happened, that have shaped the narratives and the experiences of many of us that are represented on this call even right now. It impacts our communities in many ways. So for me, the concern is the intentionality behind it, right? If people can, and I come from the lens and the framework of doing religious freedom work, right? Remembering that we have the First Amendment that says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. But what happens when a person uses their religion to justify the discrimination of another group? What happens when someone uses their religion to prohibit access to individuals at the voting box, right? What happens when that shows up in housing as well as reproductive care issues, or having access to health care? So it's a challenge, because then you're faced with the reality that, okay, I shouldn't attack the person, right? Because that's part of the nonviolent principle. I don't attack the person, I attack the actions. But at the same time, you have to address what the person is doing. And so for me, this moment, and for me, this wilderness experience is also speaking truth to the powers and the institutions that are upholding these poor examples of ethics and morals by allowing these pieces of legislation to be passed at the expense of any group. Because just because your group's name is not on the bill or not the target of it, doesn't mean it's not going to hit your homeland. It's not going to hit your own home, or your ideologies, or your belief, or your personhood. And so for me, I think there is this moral obligation for people of faith and moral conscience to really show up and speak up, no matter what the risk is. Like, you're talking about Selma, we know the people were beaten. There's a reason why it's called Bloody Sunday, right? And so there's that. But then those of us today have to be willing to take risks and speak up. If we say in the Christian tradition, like the 2 commandments that we were supposed to rest on was love God with all your might and all your being. I'm paraphrasing right now. But then the next one was to love your neighbor as yourself. So then it requires you to reimagine and think about, who is my neighbor? Who is the person that I say I love and I care about? And so for me, it's about, if you're thinking in that way, then you need to lean in and be civically engaged, and speak up about when you see pieces of legislation that have any form of discrimination, no matter what your ideologies and beliefs may be, shaped around certain things. But if it dehumanizes a person, again, if your beliefs say that that every human being matters, then our actions have to lead to such. And for me, that is just really important in doing this work when I think about these pieces of legislation. And that's the work that the center, we're committed to doing. We're committed to lending our voice to speak up and say, no, not at the expense of this person, not at the expense of their humanity. We will not do that. Because if we all are the beloved community, then we have to make sure that we're protecting the rights, the human rights and the civil rights of every single person.
Feel free to jump in here. Who's burning?
I'd love to say something. All of these attacks that are functionally part of, I believe, a right-wing Christian nationalist strategy, right, hashtag not all Christians, right? There is, as we know, fierce, beautiful, liberatory Christianity, and this is not that. This white nationalist strategy, like all of these bills are interconnected, right? Abortion bans disproportionately impact communities of color, right? Who pays the price most are Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, people who are struggling financially, immigrants, youth, people in rural communities, right? We know that. The people who are going to be dying first it's going to be disproportionately Black women because of the way medical discrimination functions in this country and systemic racism, right? Attacks on trans youth and trans healthcare is inextricably tied to larger questions about healthcare, which are inextricably tied to the larger issues around COVID and the medical discrimination and the ableism that we have been seeing over the last 2 years of this pandemic, right? It is all interconnected, right? The refusal to teach accurate history and to tell the truth about the story of our country and to talk about the racist foundations of this country are part of the larger desire to paint a story of who is in power. It's a way of bolstering power, and it's all part of a backlash against the gains that we have made over the last few decades, right? The part of us that so many of us feel like we have entered into a sort of twilight zone is because like those gains were real, and that this is backlash, and this is power realizing that queer people, people of color, like women, like there are shifts in paradigms of who can and will hold power, and this is a clenching down and an attempt to try to hold and maintain. In some ways it's many centuries old systems of power, the foundations on which our country has been created, right? And on the other side, the crisis of COVID and coronavirus has destabilized us and created this moment where adaptive leadership could have come in and said, this is an opportunity for us to create new paradigms of justice, new visions of what is and can be. Like, we're never going to be like how we were. So now we can come and create new ways of thinking about health and safety and dignity and truth, and making sure that we are getting rid of old individualistic models and remembering that we all have to take care of each other, right? That could have been the massive paradigm shift of COVID. And instead, we didn't have anybody to help us face the loss that comes with inevitable change. And so, horrors came and filled in this vacuum. And as so often has it inflection points in history, we can look at what happened during AIDS. We can look at the ways in which the flu pandemic, gave rise to the Holocaust, right? It's all interconnected. And these questions about who gets dignity, who gets safety, whose body is public property, who gets to decide what happens to their own body and their own life, right? Who gets a voice, who gets a vote, right? They're all interconnected. And so we have to just continue to remember again and again. And this is, I think, the message that each of us have been saying, like, our traditions teach us that we are all created, whether it's that we're all created in the divine image, we are all interconnected, all of our humanity is one, right? Our solidarity work has to be all as one. Our justice work has to be one. Our justice strategies have to be interconnected, right? If we can't think about it as fighting this thing and this thing and this thing, we have to be all together fighting all of that.
That is great. Yeah, it is all interconnected. The strategies have to be interconnected. Hurunnessa, Manjit, who would like to jump in? Anything to add on these bills and what it's all about, the analysis?
This is fascinating, and I love that I'm hearing these various dimensions of what we are facing here. The two things that come to my mind, which I think is of highest priority, is one is immediate. What do we do to counter what we're seeing? And the second is to understand what's motivating these actions. So the motivation, obviously, there are various facets to that. It's I wish it was simple and there was just one primary reason. I mean, in some ways, there is one primary reason. I'll talk about it, but I think our combined collective efforts of people of faith, people of true faith, not people of misguided faith, has to be to fight this, because it could be our turn tomorrow. I mean, even though it is our turn right now, but it could be we could be more in the direct line of fire, so to speak. And I apologize for my choice of words, but that's how I see it. So we need to come up with some collective measures to counter what's happening before it becomes much more rooted. And the second is to understand what's motivating and prompting these actions. And I'll say one thought around that. I believe it is some sense of insecurity, and that insecurity could stem from multiple dimensions. Becoming a minority both in terms of race, becoming a minority in terms of faith, becoming a minority in terms of influence, becoming a minority in terms of power. I think that's what's driving. And added to that, the greed of privilege, and the greed of maintaining the power of privilege, and the control that one exercises through that power. I'll stop there, but those are the two priorities in my opinion.
So helpful to put that on the table. The fear and the becoming a minority, and even these efforts, I think, to divide and conquer and to drum up that fear, which at least helps me get sometimes to a little compassion to those who are participating in that, to figure out how to address it. Hurunnessa, looks like you're ready.
Yeah, these are really great topics to talk about, and I wish we had all the time in the world to, dive deeper into it. And what Sabrina said about bills being stacked up, we see one face, but there's so many other faces behind those bills, and what that means for a community as a minority community, myself, where we've been targeted since 9/11. It's so important for us to realize how these types of issues and bills that are being passed and surveillance affects the community as a whole, and how we of people of faith have to be mindful of these things, because it's us today, but it could be you tomorrow, right? And how do we prevent that? Because if we're saying the laws are for everyone, how do we come to that stage where we're understanding that violating one group is as if we're violating everyone here in the United States, regardless of where they're from and how they practice. And even now for me, sometimes I'm a bit scared going to certain parts of the United States with my hijab because I'm so visibly Muslim. There are parts where my daughters will say, you can take your hijab off here because we don't want hate crimes being done against you. And they've said that to me. And, all of this stems from things being handed down from top down, right? When a government issues certain rulings or certain surveillances that they're doing on a community, it trickles down to the community as well, to the rest of the country. And individuals will feel that they have a right to now start doing these things as well. So there's a really fine line of making sure that we're part of the conversation, making sure we know who we're talking to and what these bills actually translate into. Last year, we did this whole segment of once a week for 4 weeks. We did a whole training just for the Muslim community, for example, where we taught them. I had my friend Rahma Abdul Alim come and had a conversation with her on a webinar for 4 weeks about the history of the enslaved for the last over 400 years and what that means to the Muslim community, because Muslims don't understand the history of what has happened in this country. Majority of them are new immigrants. They're like, what do you mean enslavement? What does that look like? So we did a whole segment in educating the Muslims about what has happened, because they feel that it doesn't connect to them. But again, I'm not Black, but I understand that it's my duty as a human being to making sure that people in my community know the history of what was going on. And even if it's just a webinar, the content is out there for people to listen to. And even those little steps that we take add to a bigger picture of making sure that we're going down the path where freedom and dignity and rights are afforded to everyone.
That's really rich. Again, connecting all the dots. I got to talk to, thank you for putting the Islamophobia and sort of, police state. I got to interview Dr. Halal last night and given another shout out to her book. Because we're heading toward the closing segment here, I would love to hear what your call to communities is in this moment, so that we can achieve this vision of a multi-faith, multiracial democracy, and what gives you hope. Those two questions are interrelated, so speak to one or both. But what's your charge to our listeners today?
So the beloved community is sanctified in I've lost everybody. Can you still hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Oh, wonderful. You all disappeared. The beloved community is sanctified in the Hindu tradition, in our oldest book, the Rig Veda, in the words Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which means the world is one sacred family. And we have teachings like Tattvam Asi, and all of these mean that we are one, and God is in you and me. And Tattvam Asi goes beyond that. It just doesn't just mean that we are connected. It literally means I am that. And it means that the self is identical to the universal self. It is absolute oneness. And that does not allow for the other. So for me, the charge is to really live out that sense of oneness. And in Selma, we met a whole bunch of the foot soldiers, the real heroes of Selma, people who were on the bridge on Bloody Sunday. And there was one man in particular, his name's Frank Hardy. He was 9 that day, and he talks about being 9 and feeling the tear gas and running. He, ever since then, especially in the last 20 years, has been trying to organize something that he calls the Defiant Run. And Defiant Run is where you shackle yourself, literally, to a person of a different race, and I would say a different caste or a different religion, somebody other than you. And then you train together, and then you do a run together. So I see all of the work that we are called to do as a defiant run to justice. A relative of mine asked me on the day that Srinivas Kuchibhotla was killed some number of years ago, a Hindu in Kansas. And he was killed by a white man who shot him. And then as he shot him, what he said showed that he thought he was an Arab. So in the Hindu community, and he was a Hindu, and the Hindu community, a Hindu had been shot. So all of a sudden there was this awakening because the hatred had come for us on that day. We didn't realize that the hatred comes for us every day. And a relative of mine said, what should I do? And I told that relative, go to a church, go to a mosque, go to something that is not a Hindu temple and get involved. And so that's the defiant run. And so I think what I would say is my calling, the calling of any group I participate in, any conversation I participate in, is that we should stand up and be in solidarity with people and struggles that are not necessarily our own, and see them as our own, and then do the work within our communities to motivate those communities towards justice for all.
Thank you. Who's next? Jump in. What's your charge to us?
Go ahead, Sabrina.
I love that. That fueled my fire. I would say I want to add to that is like people need to get involved. They need to get involved. Going back to those bills, understanding the significance of the bills and what is happening, that they're targeting public schools. And what we have to remember about public schools is that public schools are for everyone, no matter what your economic status is, no matter what your racial status is, no matter what your religious identity is, no matter what your gender identity or sexual identity may be, that public schools are supposed to serve everyone without discrimination because they are funded by the government. And so my charge is for faith communities and faith leaders to protect and advocate for public schools, to advocate for money to go towards public schools and not private school vouchers. If you know anything about private school vouchers, they were created in the 1950s and 60s to defy desegregation orders. In other words, white people didn't want their white children going to school with black children. But public schools, as they're defined, are for everyone. And so we have to make sure that funding is going towards public schools. But the other thing is to get involved, be civically involved, like take actions to address issues that impact not only your community, but the communities that you say you love that are part of the beloved community. One of the things for our organization is that, we showed up to give public comment when HB 787 was proposed. And so unfortunately it was still passed. But the reality is we showed up to speak up and to present a different narrative about something that was so divisive. And also what faith leaders need to understand is we have to remember not just to lean into our faith, but also lean into the experts that are guiding us in these conversations. Because one of the things that we need to remember about these bills that are targeting certain groups, but at the root of it trying to reimagine how history should be taught in the classroom, is that the National Council for the Social Studies wrote recommendations in partnership with 13 other professional organizations that talks about how students should explore history and that questioning is important. So you can't talk about certain things in history and skip over the enslavement of Africans, the Japanese internment camps, or the extermination projects that targeted Native communities, because all of those shaped how we got to some of the policies that we're at now. And that includes talking about voting rights, right? Students should know about Evelyn Thomas Butts, a Black woman from Norfolk, Virginia, who sued the governor because of the polling tax, because it violated her 14th Amendment right. So my charge is that faith communities, faith leaders, and people of moral conscience, because our non-religious friends are also a part of this fight too, is that we speak up, we take action, and get involved. Like, get involved in the voting rights campaign. Say something when you see a piece of legislation that doesn't resonate with your beliefs. That's the moral obligation that we have to do the work that we say we believe in as people as part of the beloved community.
Wonderful. 30 seconds each for the remaining. This is a challenge.
I think one of the things that resonated with me today is just Sunita's story. I came to this country as a refugee from Afghanistan, but I was part of the first wave of refugees who came to the United States in the early 1980s. And just hearing her story of going out for people who are not like her, who are not part of her faith, who don't look like her, who don't pray like her, who don't speak like her, who don't eat like her. And she felt that it was something that resonated with her as a human being, I think speaks volume in terms of what we all can do. Because how many times do we put ourselves in harm's way when we take a risk for someone who doesn't look like us, who doesn't see things the way we do? And still we say, no, that person has the right to exist, the right to freedom, the right to education. Women in Afghanistan have been put in a series of issues when a lot of them come here, they hate Islam because of what they've gone through. And we have to teach them what our faith is really all about. But when you're looking at it from a perspective of someone who isn't even Muslim, to go there and advocate in a fairly, I would say, dangerous place. I haven't been there since I was 2. So, for us, it seems like, oh, it's that land you don't go to because you don't feel safe, as people who lived here in the United States. But I want to use Sunita as an example in this, and we should all try to do what she has done. So thank you, Sunita.
Awesome. Danya?
I just want to say, we need all hands on deck, and there's a lot of deck, right? Everybody has a role. Everybody has a job. We need people donating money. We need people crunching data. We need people organizing. We need people doing graphic design. There are so many pieces of the work, and we need everybody's time, talents, capacity. There is so much need and so much urgency, and there is a role for everybody. So figure out where you want to be and where you need to be, but get on deck.
Every bit counts. Manjeet?
Thank you. Great discussion and input and suggestions and perspectives. So 2 or 3 things come to mind. One is, if you think you're not affected, you actually are. And if you are not sure, try to walk into the shoes of your neighbor of color. And especially if it's an African American, walk in their shoes for a day, for a week, even for a few hours, to know exactly what it is that we are facing. And second, do something, whatever. Like the rabbi said, some people can volunteer time, some people can provide financial support, and some people can actually, do the work. So roll up your sleeves and do something. And third, don't lose hope, because that's what the other side wants, is that there is this silent majority that opposes what they're doing but doesn't take action. And don't be a silent majority. Make some noise and provide some measure of pushback, of standing up. Thank you.
I'm looking at the comments and people are truly inspired, and I feel inspired in this moment. There are times when I get overwhelmed, but when we come together like this and share our values, I know we can do this. And it is our solidarity that gives me hope. We're all connected. What happens to one of us happens to all of us. The power of our sacred texts that have to be reclaimed, the solidarity in this moment, and we need all hands on deck. Every bit counts. Thank you all so much for being here. I am looking forward to being in solidarity with you all in the year ahead. Blessings on your work and in this journey, and onward we go. Thanks everyone for coming.